Jessica Sofia Tomas Vizcaya was only 3 years old when her life was taken in a tragic story of violence and misery. Her death was turned into a dark and depressing drama, where she was the only innocent one. The perpetrators of this crime are already in custody and are awaiting trial in pretrial detention. Jessica's funeral ended up turning into a huge public trial, where the inhabitants of Setúbal, a Portuguese city located in the metropolitan region of Lisbon, pointed fingers and threatened with death the one they considered the true culprit for the tragedy. Jessica's mother. I'm Marcos, welcome everyone, and folks, the case I'm going to present today is particularly morbid and sad. So, here's the warning, and let's get to the facts. On the morning of June 20, Inés Tomás arrived at her partner's house carrying her daughter. The girl had visible injuries on her face and was completely motionless. Paulo Amancio couldn't understand what was happening because he believed his stepdaughter had gone to a summer camp. Inés said she had fallen off a chair at daycare and that a doctor prescribed a medication called Outrage, an antihistamine derived from piperazine and used as a sedative. That's why she was sleeping so deeply. Paulo saw that it wasn't the right time to confront Inés with the contradictions in that version. But you didn't have to be a detective or a doctor to realize that something wasn't right. He probably could have thought that maybe there was a daycare at the summer camp. Just over a week ago, the couple received a visit from a social worker at their home, located in a poor neighborhood of Setúbal. The visit was to assess the child's admission to a community daycare. And seeing that everything was apparently fine, the social worker informed that Jessica would soon be accepted, where she could integrate into a healthy environment and interact with other children. However, what the social worker didn't know was that this child's life had not been easy at all. Even though she had just turned 3 years old on the last 26th of January, Jessica had already suffered a lot. First, her mother's relationship with her biological father, Nelson, Inés's previous partner, was troubled, with frequent episodes of physical and psychological violence that the girl witnessed and indirectly ended up suffering from. Mother and daughter even ended up living on the streets when the relationship between Nelson and Inés became unbearable and they were forced to leave home. Nothing that the woman's relatives hadn't seen before. Inés Tomás was 37 years old and Jessica was already her 6th daughter. 4 of them lived with relatives. The oldest was institutionalized at the request of her own grandmother, Inés's mother. To give you an idea, in her very first month of life, Jessica was monitored by the Hospital Center for Children and Youth at Risk in Setúbal, which in turn initiated a promotion and protection process by the Commission for the Protection of Children and Youth, the Commission for the Protection of Children and Youth, because of the abuse that the biological father inflicted on his partner. The police frequently visited the couple's residence due to complaints from neighbors. After that, the girl was monitored by the Commission for the Protection of Children and Youth until February 2019, when the public prosecutor's office determined that there was no evidence of abuse or parental neglect, and the case was closed. Unfortunately, there are no means, nor enough human, technical, or logistical capacity for children at risk to be truly protected by the state. As in many other countries, this constitutional bureaucracy is nothing more than a huge patchwork quilt. After all, no manual of good intentions is able to intervene in time. The reality is miserable, and sometimes it's more than obvious the inability to protect a child at risk. Even though Inés was no longer living with Jessica's father, that didn't mean the violence was over. Many times, in fact, that violence would intensify. After a while, Inez's ex-partner moved to the Netherlands in search of work. And now she was free. She could finally move on with her life, meet a good person, and live a normal life. It was around that time that Inez met Paulo, and they decided to live under the same roof. A small and modest house where the child didn't have a room, but just a corner. Jessica never had a choice. She was born into poverty, a certain kind of structural misery, in many ways hereditary, that society deep down is not able to recognize. In the 3 years of her short life, she was not just a child who witnessed violence at home, but also became the target of that excessive violence. She started showing up with marks on her body, but they weren't as visible as the ones she had on the morning of June 20th of this year. It was Paulo Amancio who gave the preliminary account of the events to the police, when this case became a media sensation for the most nefarious of reasons. It turns out that when Inez arrived that day, the girl seemed very drowsy, but they assumed it could be the effect of the medication. Silently, Paulo knew that the girl's injuries were not consistent with the story of an accidental fall. The injuries on her face were very obvious. Inez had something to hide, something that weighed on her conscience. After all, why didn't she take her daughter straight to a hospital when she picked her up? Where was she? Supposedly at that daycare whose existence Paulo was unaware of. Not only Paulo, but practically everyone who knew the couple believed that Jessica was at the summer camp. Nothing made sense. Meanwhile, Jessica remained motionless. At the beginning of that evening, around 6 o'clock, Inez finally gathered the courage and called emergency services. From that moment on, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Unfortunately, time that Jessica didn't have. The paramedics rushed to the residence, and when they got there, they found that the girl had purple marks on her face, arms and legs, bruises on her abdomen, and her pupils were completely dilated. According to the rescue team, the condition of her pupils showed the obvious. Something very serious had happened to that child. This could mean two things or both. Sign of several hours of suffering or injuries and trauma to the head. The ambulance rushed to São Bernardo Hospital in Setúbal. Inez was accompanying her daughter, powerless to prevent the inevitable. Despite the respiratory maneuvers and repeated attempts at resuscitation, unfortunately, Jessica did not survive her injuries. She passed away in her mother's arms before even arriving at the hospital. The doctor could only declare her death. And faced with the death of a child only 3 years old, under objectively violent circumstances, he called the police authorities since he found about 57 marks of aggression. It was a case for the Setúbal Judicial Police since it was a crime. There was no doubt, although the circumstances were still shrouded in mystery. A mother's tears who had just lost her daughter couldn't speak for her, and even in a state of shock, Inez needed to provide a coherent explanation for the extent of the injuries that led her daughter to death. It didn't take long for the case to reach the Portuguese media and soon after, the world. Although it was proven that Inez was a victim of domestic violence throughout her life, it wouldn't take long for her to become the main suspect, along with her partner Paulo. The pressure was overwhelming. Inez was not used to having cameras and microphones pointed at her, not to mention a legion of journalists at her doorstep. Even so, she stood her ground as best she could, giving the same account she had given her partner when she arrived home with the girl in her arms. However, she was unable to answer the most basic questions. Which summer camp was Jessica at? What was the name of the daycare, and who was the doctor that prescribed Outrage? Inez just cried while many, sharing in the grief, felt compassion. Everyone needed an answer, but Inez said nothing when asked about the details. Usually she stayed silent, cried, shook her head no, and only answered basic things like her name, her daughter's name, and where they lived. This situation turned into a tragic soap opera where the main characters were them, the journalists, and the main suspect of the most heinous of crimes. It was her, Inez, who kept up with the contradictions of a fiction she herself created. Her suffering was as evident as her lie. Thirsty for the big news, the journalists crowded in front of the woman's house so much that she couldn't go out anymore. Until one of them managed to convince her to give an exclusive interview. The journalist was allowed to enter the residence to see where the girls slept and realize the precarious conditions in which they lived. In the house, there were no photos or toys of Jessica. The investigators from the Setúbal Police Department, who had already searched Inez's house on the morning of the 21st, also noticed something strange. In the residence, there weren't even any clothes of Jessica, photos, or any indication that a child lived there. Paulo Amancio explained that the couple decided to throw the clothes in the trash to avoid bringing back the painful memory. The couple's bedroom was completely messy and full of trash on the floor. That didn't sound good to the public, who were increasingly hungry for answers. The fact is that the main suspicion fell on Inez and Paulo, but later everyone's focus shifted to Inez. That it was a crime, no one had any doubts anymore. The girl's biological father, before traveling to Portugal, spoke to journalists by phone, stating that his daughter was repeatedly mistreated by her mother. At that point, all that was needed was for Inez to at least confess to actually committing the murder, because the verdict had already been given by everyone. The results of the autopsy were released on Wednesday, June 22nd, and provided strong evidence about the extent of the cruelty of this crime. That, along with the countless contradictions from the mother. It was then becoming uncontrollable. On any channel, from any network, at any time of day, if you turned on the television, someone was talking about the death of little Jessica. In the meantime, the police continued their investigation discreetly so as not to interfere with the unfolding of events. Furthermore, the autopsy report ruled out suspicions of sexual abuse. The investigators shocked everyone with the possibility of the existence of a nanny, which completely undermined the stories about the summer camp and the daycare, which, to be honest, few people actually believed. Quickly, all attention turned to this new character, who until then had remained anonymous. It didn't take long for everyone to find out. Jessica had been placed in the care of a 52-year-old woman named Ana Cristina, known to everyone as Tita. The woman lived just a few blocks from Inez's house. Tita lived with Justo, her 58-year-old husband Esmeralda, their 27-year-old daughter, and a granddaughter who was the same age as Jessica. The strange thing is that Tita wasn't known for babysitting. Under pressure, Inez confessed everything. However, by that point, Tita and her entire family had already fled Setúbal. Inez told the police that Jessica, little Jessica, used to play with Tita's granddaughter, who was the same age as her. According to her, one day, the woman lured the girl into her house and didn't let her leave anymore, saying that Inez would have to pay 400 euros if she wanted her daughter back. This amount would be for a job that Tita had done for the woman and that she still hadn't paid for. The job in question was actually a love-binding spell. Tita claimed to control magical forces and promised Inez that no man would ever leave her again. Apparently, the relationship between Paulo and Inez was already not going well, something Paulo would later confirm to the police. Inez had no way of knowing that this order would cause the death of her 3-year-old daughter and, to make matters worse, her separation. After so much exposure, Jessica's stepfather and mother asked for police protection, but only he returned home. Inez went to her mother's house. On that same day, Tita's family, who was on the run, was detained by the police in an abandoned house in the Cova das Faias neighborhood in Leiria. They were all taken to the Setúbal police station, where they would be interrogated. On the morning of June 23rd, the Setúbal police issued an official statement to the press that said the following. Following the death of a 3-year-old child, which occurred on June 20th, the Judicial Police, through the Criminal Investigation Department of Setúbal, located, identified, and arrested a 58-year-old man and 2 women, aged 52 and 27. They are strongly suspected of committing the crimes of qualified homicide, serious bodily harm, kidnapping, and extortion. This way, the 5 days leading up to Jessica's death were explained. What was still unexplained was the real reason for the torture and extreme violence that little Jessica was subjected to. Tita started being called a witch by the media. And even with the main perpetrator of the crime in custody, the People's Justice had already focused its anger on someone else, who supposedly made all of this possible. The mother. Inés was still not free from blame, and the people of Setúbal were willing to turn her life into a real hell. And hell broke loose that very day, during the wake of Jessica Biscaya. In a local chapel, television shows were broadcasting live the theater of human misery outside a small chapel. With the arrival of Nelson, the girl's biological father, a crowd began to gather outside. Despite the police protection, there were too many people. Little by little, several people with a sense of justice were already forming an enraged crowd. When Inés arrived to mourn her daughter's body under police escort, a chorus of vigilantes shouted in unison, "Murderer, murderer! People went after her like hungry dogs, looking for a bone to gnaw on. The police tried to maintain order with difficulty and a lot of patience. They noticed that Inés's presence in the chapel was a danger to everyone, but she was determined to say her final goodbye to her daughter. However, people felt it was time for a popular uprising in a suburban version of the classic book Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. The televisions were broadcasting live. In the middle of the thirsty crowd, Jessica's maternal grandfather stumbled and fell to the ground. The girl's stepfather asked people to respect the family's pain, but even the relatives seemed unable to contain their feeling of revolt. Jessica's paternal grandmother acted out in fury, calling the girl's mother a murderer and a monster. People tried at all costs to attack Inés, and taking advantage of the confusion, a woman approached the police cordon and managed to land a punch on her. Tempers flared even more, and if it weren't for the police, a lynching would have been broadcast live on Portuguese television. Inés managed to get to the wake by entering the chapel under heavy police escort and a chorus of insults all around, but she was advised to leave the place, and she managed to leave with her mother, being slapped by the crazed crowd, and the two got into a police car. Inside, Inés felt sick and pretended to faint, but soon regained consciousness. At the end of the day, even with the chapel doors closed, no one wanted to leave, believing that Inés would return, but she did not come back. At 10 o'clock in the morning on June 24th, 2022, the date set for Jessica's funeral, a crowd was already gathering at the door of the Nossa Senhora da Anunciada Chapel, not far from Luisa Todi Avenue in Setúbal. Once again, a reinforced police contingent tried to calm the population, understanding the delicacy of the situation and the social alarm caused by the death of a child, especially under circumstances that everyone knew about. Hundreds of police officers cleared the streets and blocked the passages with their vehicles, which didn't help much. But despite the outrage, everyone should respect the family's pain, who were there to honor the memory of little Jessica. But the environment around was a real ticking time bomb, fueled by the media circus. The crowd began to calm down when they learned that Inés would not be present at the wake, but even so, everyone remained alert. Without the slightest moral embarrassment, the reporters kept repeating the most sordid details of this tragedy. Amid a war for ratings, the story of little Jessica took on an increasingly macabre tone, and this only fueled the brutality of the hundreds of fathers and mothers outraged by the crime and without the slightest sense of shame. Suddenly, the local television stations started spreading the news that Inez was on her way to her daughter's funeral. The news hit like a nuclear bomb, and the situation started to become completely unbearable, on the verge of madness. But no one was sure if the news was true or not. To give you an idea, several people started hunting for the police car that would take Inez to the cemetery. It became clear to everyone that there was no possible truce, and that what had happened the day before in the chapel had only been a sample of what was about to happen. For many, this time, the lynching would be inevitable. The same people who, the day before, had turned the wake of Jessica Sofia Tomas Vizcaya into a morbid suburban soap opera were there with renewed energy and an irresistible thirst for revenge. Inez was hidden, disguised, but she went, without anyone noticing, inside the funeral car. What happened next was an absolutely degrading spectacle. When the girl's coffin made its way down the path toward the cemetery, an uncontrollable collective madness began. The journalists lost all sense of journalism. People lost their sense of humanity, even the most basic principles of respect for a dead child. There, the coffin of a 3-year-old girl, a victim of fate, a victim of poverty, a victim of circumstances, was the most innocent of all those present. When she left for her final resting place, the procession followed behind the funeral car, where her grieving mother did her best to hide from the crowd. By the roadside, everything looked more like a military convoy pursuing the enemy than a funeral march. A mix of popular justice, broadcasting without filters, a human tragedy buried far deeper than 6 feet under its nature. Jessica's mother couldn't get out of the funeral car, and suddenly, some people recognized her. It didn't take long for people to start banging on the windows with all their strength, accusing her of her daughter's death, demanding her life. No one was there to mourn the poor child. In truth, everyone just wanted revenge. After tossing dirt on her granddaughter's coffin, the paternal grandmother joined the vigilantes. The girl's biological father took the gravedigger's shovel and began to bury his daughter, like he was on a construction site wanting to rush time. People were crying, screaming, running, filming, and speaking into microphones. The funeral car where Inez was sped out of the cemetery as if fleeing the scene of a crime. The crowd chased after her, and only then did this poor girl finally find some peace. In the end, 3 people are under arrest for the child's death. They are Tita, her husband, and their daughter. All of them are still waiting for the legal decisions of the presiding judge before they can finally go to trial. In any case, while the criminal responsibility for the death of little Jessica Vizcaya is being investigated, there are other related points that deserve reflection. The first is factual and common sense. If a child was flagged as being in danger, was protected and monitored by the authorities, it is someone's responsibility to ensure her well-being, especially since a social worker confirmed that she was living in a comfortable home. Those of you who follow the channel, my friends, know very well that history repeats itself, right? Jessica died violently at the hands of others. Whoever or whatever failed in this process failed gravely. Inez remains under the responsibility of the state until the final developments of the process, and her whereabouts are kept absolutely confidential. She has not made any further statements about the case, and her relationship with Paulo Amancio has come to an end. On Thursday, July 21st, his lawyer said he is considering his removal from Portugal for security reasons. If there are any updates on the case, I'll pin them in the comments, okay? So we end this case, unfortunately, without a resolution, at least a legal one for now. Thanks for joining me. See you next episode.